can.
I like it when we stand in honor of God and read His Word. I know there's arguments against it that you stand up every time you read the Bible in the middle of the sermon and things like that, but I like that at the front. All right, this morning, kind of starting off, a couple of weeks ago, Billy Moore opened his sermon with kind of an illustration saying that Troy has entrusted him with one verse, and he trusted Andrew with 2 verses, and entrusted me with 9, and related that to the parable of the talents. And I don't know if what he meant by that was he meant Troy trusted me more than he does you, or so Troy, what is it? No comment. Don't pick on a man who's suffering from jet lag. Or that it's easier to do 9 verses rather than 1 verse in the time allotted for a sermon. And both have their challenges. And so let's go ahead and get started as we work through Matthew 7 verses 15 through 23. The first thing to notice, we're going to title this message "Beware of False Prophets." That's kind of the overall theme of the text. And so if we're being commanded here to beware of false prophets, what does Jesus mean by the term beware? Well, defined by itself, the word itself kind of just means to have in addition to. It's kind of a weird definition for the word beware, but the idea is this originally was a nautical term that kind of meant hold the ship in one direction. So as you're kind of steering a ship, you've got all kinds of distractions and other things to deal with, but your focus has to be on getting the ship from point A to point B. And so the idea here is to get your heart, your eyes, your ears in focus on this particular thing. And this particular thing is false prophets. Well, what is a false prophet? Well, a false prophet is simply someone who claims to be a prophet of God, or someone who claims to speak on behalf of God, and what they say is false. Okay, in fact, in the Greek, it's pseudo-prophetes, and we know what pseudo means. We say pseudo this and pseudo that, and we mean that it looks like the thing, but it really isn't the thing. Okay, and so that's kind of our groundwork that we're starting with here is how to beware. Well, we beware by focusing our attention on, our ears on, our hearts on, our eyes on what this particular prophet or this particular person, in a sense, even me standing here, people who claim to speak on behalf of God, and to wonder whether what they are saying is really true or not. Now, we're going to attempt to look at 5 reasons why we should beware of false prophets. Okay, so reason number 1 is pretty easy, and that is we must beware, because Jesus said so. Now, how many of you at some point in maybe your childhood heard the statement, "Because I said so," from your parents? Amen. I heard an amen from the front there. Let's take up an offering. No, because I said so. There, that statement that parents say. Now, how many of you as parents, here's the kicker. How many of you, when you were children, you heard "because I said so," but years later happened to say it to your sweet little angels as well? Yeah, you did that. And how many of you were shocked at that moment and you said, "Uh-oh, I've become my parents"? And then your grandparents laugh because you go to them and say, "Mom and Dad, guess what I just said?" And they kind of chuckle because they know that they experienced the same situation when they said it to you when you were a child. But in this situation, no matter how justified, and we are justified when we say "because I said so," because our kids usually don't believe the first 7 reasons we give them. Why, da-da-da-da-da, why, da-da-da-da-da, why, da-da-da-da, why, and you say it? Exactly. And we feel justified in saying that, and in a way we are. Sometimes we lose patience and we get frustrated and we say it out of that reason, and sometimes we say it after the second time when we're really impatient or something like that. But for the most part, "because I said so" is a justified reason to say that to our children. But in this case, if I were to say something like, "Beware false prophets, because Jesus said so," he would be way more justified than we are in saying that to our children. And we could end the sermon right here. We could say, "Beware of false prophets, because Jesus said so," mic drop, sing a song and go home. You know, that it would be that kind of moment that we could do that. But Jesus graciously and mercifully delivers for us a few other reasons here in the text. So, reason number one is because Jesus said so, and reason number two is this: we must beware because false prophets look like us on the outside. We must beware because false prophets look like us on the outside. Notice here that it says in verse 15 that when false prophets come into our congregation, they are dressed like sheep. So what does that mean? Two things. Number one is this: they portray themselves as harmless. The sheep's clothing can be taken in this text as kind of a metaphor showing that they are trying to portray themselves as meek and gentle as a lamb. And that is a metaphor that is throughout the Scriptures, especially applying to Jesus, because, for instance, in Isaiah 53, that great prophecy of this suffering servant that is coming, the man of sorrows who would suffer for his people, it says there in verse 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. And I've never sacrificed a sheep for temple worship or anything like that, but from what I understand, that they can be so meek and gentle that, they kind of, not to be too gory, but they slice the throat and collect the blood in a basin, and the sheep has been known in its gentleness and meekness to be able to lap up its own blood. And we're done. Sorry, in the statement. But that just shows the meekness. I mean, if someone were to come up to us and do some kind of heinous thing like that, we'd be going, "Whoa, what'd you do that for?" And be freaking out over that moment. But lambs or sheep, I don't know if they're stupid or they're actually meek and gentle, but they show that meekness and gentleness. And here was Jesus, literally beaten and bloodied and sacrificed on the cross, and did not spit in return, and did not lash back, and did not do that sort of thing. So a false prophet can come into the situation and try to portray themselves as relatively harmless, like a lamb and like a sheep. And we should be aware of that, because we tend to not, when it comes to point blame or point fingers at one who spreads false doctrine, we usually don't point to the person who's calm and quiet and relatively harmless. And yet, false teachers attempt to try to do that. But not only that, they wear the sheep's clothing because they seek to look like us. Now, can you imagine if false prophets actually fit this description? I mean, that'd be helpful. I mean, one Sunday morning, you're kind of sitting in your ABF class, and all of a sudden, Ken Bandy walks in a sheep coat with a sheep head hoodie to match. And you kind of go, what's going on here? Ken must be a false teacher. Or something like that. It would be nice if, they had a sheepskin about them as they're walking around. You could kind of go, don't listen to that guy. Don't listen to that girl. Don't listen to that guy. Because they're walking around in sheepskin. But that's not what we're talking about here. Why would someone come to a group of somethings in sheepskin clothing? Because the group they're coming to are sheep. Right. Coming to our sheep. I kind of an artist on the side, and I'm from Oklahoma, so all the art you do usually are Indians and horses and tents and and stuff like that growing up. And I remember a picture specifically of two Indians creeping up on some sort of herd of something, and they literally had the animal skin on top of them, even though they looked really nothing like that particular thing. But animals have a way of just kind of doing that. Kind of like here we are as a kind of a out there like a herd of sheep. We're kind of grazing, kind of baying, doing things the sheep do. And up comes the false prophet, and we see the skin and we see the clothing, and we kind of say, "Hey, what's your name? Welcome to the flock." And that's why this is really an important reason to beware of false prophets. Because if we think that we have some innate ability to identify false prophets at first sight, that's a sure sign we make ourselves vulnerable to the next one coming in. We may say, and most people do say this, he's so nice, he's so funny, he's so eloquent, he's so down to earth, he's just like you and me. And that's exactly what the false prophet wants to hear. Because not only is he trying to look like us on the outside, but point number 3 is this: we must beware because false prophets are not like us on the inside. And as we see the description of what they are on the inside, they couldn't be any more different than we are. Because verse 15 says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." That word ravenous, interestingly enough, in the New Testament is the same word for extortioner. The reason that is interesting is because many of the false teachers or false prophets that are quote-unquote picked on or pointed out today are those that are in the prosperity gospel. Those who say that, you have to give in order to get. And for the most part, those teachers are saying that in order to pad their own pockets, rather than to truly point out some way in order for you to be blessed by God. So it's very interesting that this word ravenous is the same word used for extortioner. In fact, in Luke 18:11, when Jesus is talking about the Pharisee praying and in his self-righteous attitude, he says, "The Pharisee standing by himself prayed thus, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners,'" and there's that same word used here for ravenous, "unjust adulterers, or even like this tax collector." But in Matthew 7, verse 15, the word here is applied to the actions of a wolf. And so not only does it mean extortioner, but it means to be aggressively greedy or to snatch at things. If you've ever seen you don't even need to see a wolf. As a pest control person, I have gained an unhealthy fear of dogs. And the reason is, even dogs that are friendly towards me at first, I can go back in 2 minutes and it's like they don't know me and they snatch at you. They bite at you and other things like that. And so probably way less than an actual wolf in the woods coming at you and those types of things. But if you've ever seen a wolf attack or anything like that, they are just literally tearing things to shred. So false prophets are not different in that they're quirky or shorter or they speak with an accent. False prophets are different in that they want to rip us apart. And we should always beware or be on the lookout for someone who would want to tear us to shreds. Okay, so reason number 4 is, not only do they look like us on the outside, but they want to tear us apart on the inside. But reason number 4 is this: we must beware because false prophets are sick. And not in a good way. Like, man, that false prophet was sick. Or something like that. Sick is kind of a positive term these days, but, words like sick or dope or, in my day, words like fresh or fly, if you know that, those types of things. But here we're not talking about this, but when a prophet is sick in this sense, we're talking about diseased. And here we have in verses 16 through 20 kind of the illustration of a tree and its fruit. You notice here, follow along in verses 16 through 20, it says, "You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits." Now, a few things to notice here. First of all, false prophets are recognized by fruit, so we need to answer the question, what is fruit? Okay, fruit is essentially what is produced from a tree. So what would be the thing that is produced from a false prophet? And that is doctrine. Okay? Teaching. Now, a couple of illustrators to kind of say, I don't know, fruit could be their disciples that, follow after them, or a fruit could be their actions rather than their words or something like that. There are different, and that could be justified in the Bible. You have fruit of the womb, and that's talking about babies. You have fruit of the Spirit, and that has to deal with actions and attitudes and other things like that. But in this case, I think it specifically has to deal with doctrine, and here are two reasons why, okay? Number one is this. The Sermon on the Mount serves a ton of purposes. No doubt about it. It is a fantastic sermon that applies to many different facets and many different, we could have many different reasons why Jesus taught this sermon. But one of the reasons why, I think, is he sought to indict the Pharisees and their false teaching or their false traditions, and he sought to kind of correct the people on the right way to view God's law. For instance, the Pharisees would say, to gain heaven, you would have to obey, to be self-sufficient, count on your own righteousness. You gotta. But Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That would be absolutely foreign to the Pharisees. To be poor and needy in spirit in order to gain heaven? No, in order to gain heaven, you got to jump through these hoops. You got to do these sort of things. Or in Matthew 5, verses 19 through 20, it says, therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And I can see if there's a Pharisee in the crowd as Jesus is teaching this, the Pharisee starting to get super confident saying, that's me. I do not relax God's law. I follow it, and I teach it. And then Jesus turns it on its head in verse 20, and he says, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus says, and so the Pharisees say, that's us, and everything like that. And then Jesus all of a sudden says, you've got to be more righteous than those guys. Because the Pharisees' idea of righteousness was an external righteousness. Jumping through the right hoops, as we said, crossing all of your T's, dotting all of your I's. But God's righteousness is a righteousness that came through faith. It's a righteousness that came from the inside out. It's a righteousness that people were incapable of having short of God changing the heart. And so the Pharisees, the people of Israel were looking around to say, how can we be righteous? Oh, we need to follow those guys because they were the most righteous, and the righteousness of the Pharisees was clean on the outside, but the inside of the cup, as Jesus said, is a filthy, filthy thing. And so in pursuing or seeking to pursue righteousness by following the Pharisees, they were not following righteousness at all. But a second reason why I think we're talking about doctrine here is Luke 6. If you have your Bibles, turn over to Luke chapter 6. Luke 6 is somewhat of a parallel passage to the Sermon on the Mount. It's more of a short version. There's no doubt that Jesus might have taught this over and over again, what he was teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. A lot of people put Jesus in kind of a monolithic teaching where he teaches one thing and he's done, he moves on to the next thing. But he's 3 years doing a ministry here, and so he's teaching kind of on a plain and not on a mountain here, but he's teaching the words here are almost identical to the Sermon on the Mount. So we don't need to freak out and think, oh no, is this not the Bible because Jesus is not teaching on the mountain, that sort of thing? No, he's teaching the same thing, but he's somewhere else and that sort of thing. But in Luke chapter 6, look with me in verses 43 through 45. He says, for no good tree, kind of the same illustration, for no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its fruit, for figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of the evil treasure produces evil. And here it is, for out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. So in this particular situation, as he's potentially confronting the Pharisees with this and that sort of thing, he's saying that, a bad tree is incapable of producing good fruit. And how is that fruit seen? By the words of a person's mouth. And so I think when he says here, when he's talking about beware of false prophets for a tree this and a tree that and those types of things, he's talking about, when he's talking about fruit, he's talking about the doctrine or the teaching from a particular person. Because they're a prophet, and so they teach. And so the thing they produce is teaching, not necessarily actions, not necessarily anything else, definitely not actual fruit, but they are producing words. And so we need to beware of the words of that person. The second thing I want to look at here is that the doctrine produced by false prophets is bad doctrine. Notice here it says they are a diseased tree. That word disease literally means rotten or putrid. The second thing to notice here is that they are incapable of producing good, healthy fruit. And that's a very important point. How many of you might remember the time when you first realized your body wasn't going to do the same thing it usually does as a teenager? You ever had that moment? I remember I was in my 30s. I made it to my 30s before this first thing happened. I'm sure something happened before then, but this is the memorable moment. I was a student pastor down in Fort Walton, and my students were being crazy. The guys were being crazy. The girls were off talking to the side, and the guys were trying things to kill themselves. And so they were attempting to jump over chairs. Okay, so we had these chairs, these metal chairs that not unfolding, but stationary metal chairs that stood about this high. And they were stacking them back to front in rows and jumping over them. Oh, you do 4 chairs. Oh, you can do 5 and stuff like that. And I'm watching them do this, and I thought, I did this when I was 16 or 17 at my church. The only problem was I wasn't 16 or 17 any longer. So I said, I'm going to try this. So, you get one in the room. So I'm standing back by the stage, and I'm looking at the line of chairs, and I start running, and literally it was the strangest thing. It was almost like demon possession. My body did not do what my mind told it to do. I literally, in my mind, said, jump, and my body literally did this. And it was the weirdest thing to have your mind tell your body to do something, and your body just refuses. And I can remember that was just the first time that my body said, look, Bill, you may think you're capable of doing this, but you're not capable any longer. In this situation here with the false teachers, with this diseased tree, not only are they diseased, but it says here in verse 18 that a healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Now that word cannot means not able to. I mean, it's in the Greek, it means the word for ability. So, not able to. And then that word nor in between there means not even, no way, no chance. So if we took those definitions and rolled it back into the text, we can say a healthy tree is not able to bear bad fruit. And by the way, not even, no way, no chance is a diseased tree ever going to bear good fruit. And that's super important to know. Because the third thing kind of to realize here is going to false prophets for good teaching is a foolish thing to do. You say, yeah, I know so-and-so says this about God, and I know they don't really believe in the Trinity, but they really say some great things on marriage. Or I know about this, but but they make me feel empowered or enthused, or that they've helped me with my business or this and other things like that. And that's why Jesus says in verse 16, are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? And the implied answer is a big fat no. I mean, and kind of the other implication is, or the other reaction to that is no, who would do that sort of thing? And so with that common sense illustration, Jesus is telling us that if you go to a false teacher looking for good, eternal, righteous truths, you will not find them. They are incapable of doing that. And finally, point number 5. and that is this. False prophets, false teachers, they come to you. You do not want to leave with them. They come to you, but you do not want to leave with them. Verses 21 through 23 are certainly not limited to false prophets. There are more people than false prophets that are going to say, Lord, Lord. There are more people than false prophets that are going to participate in false wonders and false signs and other things like that. There are more people than false prophets that are going to do these types of things. There are more people than false prophets that are going to hear, depart from me, I never knew you. But definitely this includes false prophets. Therefore, to kind of continue the context of avoiding false prophets, let's look at three final things that will show us that we should not follow them anywhere. And these are the three things. Number A, as I tell the students. The ultimate deception of false prophets is this. Okay, here's the ultimate deception. First of all, they speak Christianese. Jesus says in verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And the thing to point out there is that false prophets may say, Lord, Lord, but they will not enter the kingdom of heaven. They've got the lingo down. They speak the language. What a bold thing to say, Lord, Lord, and then to teach false doctrine. But they speak Christianese, and then also not just that, but they perform mighty works. Verse 22 says, on that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many works in your name? False prophets and false teachers are capable of doing false, believable works. In Matthew 24, verses 23 through 25, Jesus is speaking about the end times, but he does say this, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets, here it is, will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Doesn't say he will lead the elect away, but he says, if possible, these things are believable enough to do that. And just to give you kind of a couple of pagan examples, my wife and I were in a meeting one time at Midwestern. We went to Midwestern Seminary, and we were at Midwestern up in Kansas City, and we were meeting with, I keep forgetting his name, but he was the IMB recruiter for that area. Pretty well-known guy, did a lot of missions in Africa. But he was talking about missions and the hardness of it, and you know, it's not a game, and other things like that. And his son was in the room, and his son kind of smiled at him and says, tell the story. And he's like, son. And he said, the Lord led me to go into, and he named the little city that was there in Africa. And he said, this was the absolute hardest place in Africa to be in at the time. Demon possession, just it's like Satan was on the throne of this place, that sort of thing. Just talking about the horrors of this place. And he said, and so I went in there and, you know, started a church and that sort of thing. And the local witch doctor came and said, you know, you leave in a week or I'm going to pronounce a curse. And he pronounced a curse on my right eye. And he said in a month and a half, his right eye died. It's gone. You know, and then you kind of do a double take and look at his, everyone's looking at his face. Then, you know, you're like, really? You know, and you could tell that eye was not a real eyeball. You know, after you looked at it. The pagans are capable of performing these false wonders. Tom Elliff, my pastor, my home church pastor, used to be the president of the IMB. He did missions down in South Africa. And he said he used to stand there and watch a witch doctor point at a hut that was several hundred feet away, and the hut would catch on fire. I don't know if there was a crony inside the hut with a match. It's a possibility. But you know, we Western Americans don't take to, we're untrusting of signs and wonders, and we ought to be. You know, we're modern and civilized and cityfied, but anyone in missions knows that some of this stuff is a little hard to explain that happens on the mission field. And I say all that just to say that, there are a ton of people in the signs and wonders movement in Christian churches who bank on the veracity and the truth of the teaching on the signs that they have seen. I remember hearing an interview of someone the other day that he's fairly fresh out of what is known as the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation, which is some of the signs and wonder stuff and that sort of thing. And he was saying, in his Aussie voice, I was in meetings and just things you couldn't explain happened. Healings and other things and stuff like that took place. And those were the things when I questioned the false doctrine that was being fed to me on a pretty regular basis, even some of the false doctrine that I was teaching. When I questioned that and was really wanting to get out, then I would think about the wonders, and that would kind of suck me back in for a while. So these false apostles are capable, and I can't explain all the signs of it in any way, shape, or form, but they are capable of performing false signs, false wonders that are believable enough, I guess, to possibly lead away the elect into believing those types of things. So this is the ultimate deception of false teachers or false prophets. They come in, they may have great and eloquent speech, but they might also perform strange, unexplainable things. But the second thing is the ultimate destination of false prophets. Look at verse 19. It says, "Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." Diseased trees, according to this illustration, are only good for firewood. And of course, fire in this verse, if it is symbolic, is symbolic for something much worse than fire, and that is eternal wrath of God, which is extremely fearful and awful and those types of things. But that's what Jesus is saying here. Ultimately, these diseased trees that are producing this bad fruit that is poisoning his people is going to eventually be lopped off, cut down, and thrown into judgment. But not only that, we see in verse 23, Jesus saying to these false teachers, as well as other people, but saying to these false teachers, "Depart from me. I never knew you." And that word depart is in the imperative voice, which basically means it is a flat-out command. No one, when hearing this, will look to Jesus and say, "Was that a suggestion?" But they will hear these very fearful words of, "Depart from me," and upon that command, those people will depart forever in judgment. But not only do we see the ultimate deception of false prophets and the ultimate destination of false prophets, but the last thing is this: the ultimate designation of false prophets. Now again, this is not just for false prophets, but one day false prophets will hear this: "I never knew you, depart from me," and here it is, "you workers of lawlessness." And that workers of lawlessness essentially just means it's a person who is against as opposed to God's law. What a tragic irony for someone who says, "I am a prophet speaking on behalf of God." But in reality, they're final and eternal. This is their eternal. This is the last label given to these people for all eternity. Not, "Depart from me, Frank. Depart from me, you who gave $500,000 to charity, but didn't quite get it." No, the eternal and final designation for these people are, "Depart from me, you who are against God's law. You who thought you were teaching God's law, depart from me because you are against my law." And so you do not want to be a follower of a false prophet, especially if this is kind of the final result for those who follow their teaching. Who wants to be on that team? I remember in the Fort, I think they do it up here too, but in the Fort Walton area, different churches gave the pregame dinner to football teams, local football teams, before they went and played their game. So we had Fort Walton Beach High School in our church to serve them a meal before the game, and I did, and then the youth pastor gets an opportunity to say a few things to the team and that sort of thing. And I was given the opportunity, and I did the rich young ruler, and shared with them, how in the end, this rich young ruler, because we have no information on the rich young ruler from that point on. So that rich young ruler, from the end of that story, is only known throughout all of human history as the ultimate loser. And I told those football players, those big burly and lean, mean, fighting machine football players, how would you like to be known as that? I know that's important to you because you don't like to lose. And you can see it in their eyes. You're right, we do not like to lose. So what is it like for all eternity to be known as the ultimate loser by giving up Christ and all of eternity in heaven for a few $1,000, $100 million, or something like that? But in this situation, what would it be like to give up God's law and to be with Him for all eternity so that you can have your ears tickled? Because, there in 2 Timothy it says that at some point at these end times there's going to be congregations of people who will be tired of actual truth, and because of their itching ears will gather teachers around them that will scratch those itches and will fall into error as a result of that. That's why we don't necessarily, in sermons like these and opportunities like these, just condemn the false prophets or the false teachers, because if you were to, knock off, so to speak, a person who is an actual false teacher today, there's a real possibility that that congregation will just get somebody as heretical. Because it feels really good, almost like a puppy dog, to just get the scratch right behind the ears at that place you cannot reach. So the dog makes that weird stretchy face, because that's the spot. But what a terrible destination, folks, to buy into flavorful, encouraging doctrine, and in the end, for all eternity, to be known as someone who hates God's law and to be thrown into the fire with the diseased trees that are there. So, ultimately, and to finish, Jesus is telling us to beware of false prophets here. And we know, we have the understanding that is reason is enough. Just like when we were children, we know that if our parents give us the first reason, that ought to be reason enough. But if we have the opportunity, we're going to why him to death. So we know that is reason enough, but He graciously warns us that though they look like us, they want to tear us apart by teaching us rancid doctrine, which, when received and lived out, will cause us to hear from God that He never knew us and that we will be condemned forever. Let's do our best as individuals to false prophet proof our congregation with all of our might. Let's pray together. Father, I want to thank you so much for the opportunity you give us to worship your name in song and in the study of your word. Lord, I pray if there's anyone here that for some reason or other they are listening to someone who is a bona fide false teacher. Or there are plenty of opportunities on the television, on the radio waves, on the podcasts, from friends and relatives who tell us about what this person said and how it was so funny and how it was so relatable and how it was so practical to their life. Maybe we have friends or family members who were involved in a worship service where signs and wonders took place, and people were healed, and marriages were brought back together, and children who had run away and are saved again, and finances were fixed, and all of the buzz phrases and the catchphrases that false teachers use today. And yet it was followed by a sermon that was diseased, rotting, putrid. Lord, I pray that if there is someone here that is listening to that saying, I know that they say this, but they're really great in this area or something like that, I pray that you will just bring them to repentance. Help us, Father, to seek for your forgiveness for the false things that we believe in, and to turn our hearts back to you, and to recommit, to refocus, to grab the wheel of the ship again and to steer it to its proper destination, keeping our eyes and ears and hearts very aware of teachers, prophets that Satan will send our way to try to knock us off our course. So, Lord, I pray that you will do what only you can do this morning. And I pray and ask these things in Jesus' name.